All right, now last week we talked about Jesus making a triumphant entry that was a statement against Roman Empire. Today, we are talking about the temple cleansing. Some of this you may have heard before, but we got to go through this thing consecutively, so pretend like it's new information. Now, after the triumphant entry, Jesus and the disciples leave the city for one night, and they return to Jerusalem the next day. And on the way back into the city, something really interesting happens. The passage in Mark says this, and Davina's got it on the screen there. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teachings. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away at its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." All right, let's share some observations with one another. What we got? Eric, what you got, buddy?
I don't have your book, so I couldn't find the answers, but I remember you were saying something about the fig tree being representative of like the Judaism or like the kingdoms or whatever. And so I was thinking like, oh, because it didn't bear fruit, this tree was not good. This like what we have going on right now is not good. And then it fast forwards to the whole like, turning of the tables and the rabbis wanting to kill him. And because he's like threatening their operation or he's threatening the way things are. So when they come back and they see the withered tree, that's like a symbolism for like how much damage he's doing to them. His talking and speaking and stuff. And yeah.
Good stuff. Good observation. Still a lot of my points. In his defense, he's at a table with one of my editors right now that's editing my book. This chapter's actually in my book. What else we got? Yes, Drew.
It's interesting because Jesus is known as a really non-violent person in general, but I think that this story is one of the only times, correct me if I'm wrong, where he does something perceived as violent and forcibly putting tables or pushing him out of the temple, and also the cursing of the tree, which is not very free. That was something we can talk about too, but especially understanding that sometimes dramatic direct action that may be perceived as intense is really working towards the overall good. The question is, did Jesus lose his temper?
Yeah.
Because of what was going on, and it really shows in the ability for humans to be fallible, but be working towards
I mean, that's one thing that I've heard over and over again when I was in the evangelical world is that like Christians were not allowed to get angry at all, right? Like it was this like forbidden emotion that we weren't allowed to express. And then when I actually started, reading the Bible for myself, I see that Jesus is pissed right here. Jesus is justifiably angry. Now, for those of you that weren't here last week, when we talked about the events that happened the day before this, all right, so the very first event that kind of started this whole sequence of event was when Jesus came into town in the triumphant entry. And a lot of people think that Jesus rode a donkey into town. That's actually not true. Jesus rode a horse, according to Mark. It was a young colt. And this colt could have been the governor's horse. There was a military parade that would go through Jerusalem to squash the chance for any type of rebellion. It was a way to show Jewish citizens that if they decide to rebel, this is the military you're going to be up against. So Jesus actually stole the governor's horse and rode it into town, professing to be the Lord of the town. So another act that was very subversive that Jesus did that's contrary to a lot of our assumptions about who Jesus was, right? So this passage on its own, and Drew just pointed this out, is a peculiar story for multiple reasons. Like, on the surface, Jesus noticed that a fig tree was not in season and cursed it, which hardly seems fair to the fig tree, right? Like, it's only functioning as nature intended it to function. It's not in season. And if you're looking at this story for the first time, Jesus killing the fig tree for not having ripe fruit when the tree was out of season appears to be much more of a childish tantrum than a profound metaphor on the surface, right? But like so many other narratives in the Bible, there is much more going on beneath the surface. There's more that meets the eye to this story. Now, the institution of Judaism, as Eric's pointed out, that Jesus adhered to, had been co-opted by Roman ideology, procedure, and policy. Similar to how American Christianity has been corrupted by the influence of right-wing extremism today. And this infiltration of imperial values in the temple royally pissed Jesus off. But what the hell did Roman influence have to do with a fig tree? Eric stole a point today, filling in for Bernie. The fig tree was an institutional symbol of ancient Judaism. It was depicted on many banners in the temple. Jesus wasn't cruelly cursing a fig tree. For all intents and purposes, Jesus was burning their flag on the way to cleanse their temple of economic injustice. I know, right? It's wild. So, yeah, it's cool. So after Jesus burned the flag, Jesus went to the temple to stir shit up. Now, in the early years of my career, I was taught that the temple cleansing was due to God's opposition of anyone auctioning any item within a sanctuary. It wasn't until years later that I would ascertain the complex layers of the story that give it a far deeper meaning, right? Now, here's one of those layers. I always pictured the temple being like a 200 to 300 seater facility, kind of like the size of our old church. That's what I pictured the temple to be. But my ignorance failed to grasp both the enormity of the temple and just how much effort was exuded by Jesus to cleanse it. Some modern scholars estimate that the people visiting Jerusalem for the Passover feast was well over 300,000 people. 300,000 Jewish people visiting the city. And they were all needing 300,000 animals to sacrifice. That's a shit ton of shit, right? Because it's a shit ton of animals. But why does that shit matter? Because the space required to house that many animals meant that the courtyard was gargantuan. This sacred building was located on top of the Temple Mount and had over 30 acres in the courtyard alone. And this acreage was reserved for livestock that would be offered during worship, as well as hundreds of money-changing tables that were used to sell sacrificial animals to Jewish people that did not bring their own animals with them to sacrifice. Now, why would they not bring their own animal to sacrifice? People that lived close in proximity to Jerusalem would bring their own animals to atone for their sins. However, folks that were traveling great distances, usually poor people that were traveling great distances to the temple, often had to purchase animals when they arrived in Jerusalem. It simply wasn't practical to go on a long journey with livestock through a desert. That makes sense, right? Now, to accommodate this need, the temple in Jerusalem would conveniently have birds, lambs, cattle, and other animals in the courtyard for visitors to purchase when they arrived. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Erected just outside the temple were statues of Caesar as a reminder of Rome's political dominance over the religious institution of Judaism. These stone depictions outside the temple of a tyrant whose ancestors ascended to power through land theft, colonization, was a source of justifiable animosity for many Jewish people. And this frustration was especially understandable considering Rome had imposed enormous exchange rates on those sacrificial animals that were being purchased by Jewish attendees. Jewish people from neighboring regions were required to convert their coin from Roman currency before they purchased the animals from the money changers in the temple courtyard. And at those tables is where Rome imposed their outrageous taxes. Now, contrary to everything I have been told, the selling of animals at the temple for the Passover feast was not the cause for the temple cleansing. The practice of selling sacrificial animals for a fair price had been going on for centuries. Actually, been going on for about 8 centuries before the temple cleansing occurred. Unjust economic legislation was the source of Christ's public display of righteous anger. And this furious spectacle of Jesus was understandable because the Passover feast is a ceremony that symbolizes God's punishment of empire. And it's a celebration of God saving those who were enslaved by empire. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus likely became distressed by witnessing the imperial corruption of a ritual that is a reminder of God's eternal opposition to tyrant kingdoms and their rulers. So upon seeing this unjust procedure of Roman exchange rates, Jesus starts flipping tables full of Roman coins. And not just a few banquet-sized tables like I had once believed. This involved hundreds of enormous tables throughout these 30 acres. Jesus marched through this courtyard, spilling the contents of these registers one by one, scattering Roman coins bearing the engraved portrait of Caesar all over the temple grounds. By the time Christ had finished this uncivilized protest, Roman currency literally littered the entire mountainside. And there was nothing that Roman guards could do to stop Jesus' disruption because Roman soldiers weren't allowed into the temple during Passover. Now, the fun doesn't stop here. This is a brilliant protest. Jesus drove thousands of animals out of the temple by releasing them from their captivity. Jesus freeing the sacrificial animals significantly impeded this ceremony. Now, this was not just an emotional outburst that frightened onlookers. Jesus intentionally hit Rome in its wallet. And this act of disobedience was meant to get the attention of corrupted government and religious officials. Many historians believe that this protest is partially what encouraged Pilate to crucify Jesus. That, and he stole the dude's ride the day before. That probably didn't help either. So, while the animals were being driven out by the hundreds, Jesus accused the temple of being a what? What did he say you are? Den of robbers. Now that comes from a passage in Jeremiah, and what's interesting about that quotation from Jeremiah is that in context, it was also a rebuke of religious leaders and governing officials. It says this, story time with Uncle Christopher, I'll read it to you. For if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly to one another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave to your ancestors forever and ever. Here you are, trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal? We'll get to him in a minute. Will you go on after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say we are safe, only to go on doing all these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? You know, I too am watching, says the Lord. That's from Jeremiah. I told you we get to Baal in a minute. Baal was a Semitic god, not part of official Judaism, but it was a Semitic religion in the land of Canaan. And it was worshipped. This god was worshipped by a very aggressive cult. This god was cruel, oppressive, and demanded the sacrifice of innocents on a regular basis. Now, by Jesus quoting the verse in Jeremiah to the people in the temple, Jesus was essentially comparing the empire of Rome and the temple to the demonic cult of Baal. So these passages prove that Jesus was trying to be a voice for those that suffered in the wake of colonizers. Throughout the gospel, Christ consistently and relentlessly shamed leaders for iniquity and chastised those in powers for inflicting hardship on others. Unfortunately for evangelical Christians, this contradicts everything that they were ever told about the gospel of Jesus. In their minds, in evangelical minds, the gospel of Jesus is a list of beliefs concerning Christ's identity and divinity that you must accept in your heart. You ever heard that before? You got to accept Jesus in your heart? Oh, I heard that all the time. And if people refuse to do so, they're going to suffer the flames of eternal hellfire. Now, according to evangelicals, once humans intellectually assent to a fundamental knowledge of Jesus as our eternal Lord and Savior, then we can be welcomed into the kingdom of heaven when we die. And evangelicals spend hundreds of millions of dollars constructing worship spaces that are designed to communicate this erroneous version of the gospel of Jesus. My question to them is this: how is the theology based in the eternal torment of non-believers cohesive with Jesus' teachings and character throughout the Gospels and the Bible? Humanity is required to turn the other cheek and pray for our enemies, but Jesus will cleanse the enemies of God with everlasting fire? That seems a little hypocritical, right? That Messiah would be a bloodthirsty tyrant, not a savior, in my mind. But luckily, historians make it abundantly clear that the fundamentalist view of life after death was not the belief of the early church. The earliest followers of Christ were Jewish, and they did not have this evangelical understanding of the next life. They believed that the righteous and the unrighteous ended up in the same location after they passed away. Meaning heaven and hell, in their mind, were in the same spot. They believed that there was not this binary eternal destination assigned to the next life, but rather heaven and hell were more of a conscious decision we all have to make in the next life. We have to accept or reject the ultimate culture of love that will reign supreme in this God's eternal kingdom. In their view of heaven and hell, the landscape of the next life is unchanging, but our individual morality that we take into the next life and our individual ideology will affect how we experience life after death. I know it sounds like I've been smoking pot when I'm explaining that, so I'm going to give you a better example. All right, so Rabbi Ham's, The Allegory of the Spoons, says this. If you've never read it, Rabbi Ham's Allegory of the Spoon says this. One day a child said to God, I would like to know what heaven and hell are like. And God showed two doors that connected to the same room. Inside the first door, in the middle of the table, was a large pot of stew. It smelled delicious and made the child's mouth water. But the people sitting around the table were thin and sickly. They appeared to be famished. They were holding spoons with very long handles, and each found it impossible to reach into the pot of stew and take a spoonful because the handle was longer than their arms. They could not get the spoons back into their own mouths. These were really long spoons. And the child shuddered at the sight of their misery and suffering. And God said, you have seen hell. Now behind the second door in the same room, it appeared the exact same way. There was a large, round pot of stew that made the man's mouth water in the center of their side of the table. The people had the same long-handled spoons, but they were well-nourished and plump, and they were laughing and they were talking, sharing life with one another. And the child said, I don't understand. And God smiled and said this. It is simple. Love only requires one skill. These people learned early on to share and feed one another, while the greedy only think of themselves. You see the ancient Jewish understanding of heaven and hell? Same spot, different morality affects how you experience the next life. Now, if you're a racist and you go to heaven and there's a lot of people of color next to you, heaven's going to suck, right? If you're homophobic and you go and you see everybody's welcomed here and all gender identities and sexual identities are welcome here, heaven's going to suck at first. Heaven, hell. Make sense? All right, so Jesus takes this understanding of the afterlife a step further by challenging the disciples not to wait for a manifestation of eternal paradise after death. When Jesus spoke of heaven and hell, it was referencing the potential for alternate realities that are always around us. Christ was not concerned with saving people from damnation in the next life when so many are going through hell in this life. This means that the gospel of Jesus was reassurance that one day tyranny and injustice will end, and justice and love will reign on this earth in a kingdom called heaven. That is inspiring. But sadly, just like in the allegory of the spoons, what would be heaven to some will be hell to others. In our depraved world, the gospel of Jesus isn't good news for everyone. Good news for the poor is bad news for the billionaire. Good news for the slave is bad news for the master. Good news for the downtrodden is bad news for the sexist, the racist, and the homophobe. Good news for the environment is bad news for industry. Good news for the victim is bad news for the victimizer. Good news to the people is bad news to the powerful. And good news for the philanthropist is bad news for the extremist. The gospel of Jesus, if preached correctly, is both a message of freedom for the downtrodden and a declaration of moral warfare to social consciences that create both the captive and the captor in our society. The notion of Christ ideological warfare is reiterated in the passages that are directly preceding the events of the temple cleansing in Mark. It says this. I'll remind you because we read it, and you probably forgot because we covered a lot of ground. The scripture said this: in the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away at its roots. And then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. So when the disciples leave the city and they leave the area where the temple cleansing just happened because they were probably in a lot of trouble, they noticed that the fig tree that Jesus had cursed on the way into Jerusalem had withered and died. The flag of unjust religious institution had officially been symbolically burned at that point. And then Jesus tells them this: have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Now, they're back at the gate where Jesus cursed the fig tree on the way to cleanse the temple, right? They're right back in that spot. Think about that geographic location when Jesus made that statement. When Jesus refers to a faith that can move a mountain, the mountain in question was the Temple Mount that hosted the Passover feast. The same temple that Jesus had just protested and stirred shit up at moments before. Jesus was saying that this temple, corrupted by unjust empire or empirical rule and institutional religion, could even be thrown into the sea if necessary. Now, we've talked about this a lot before. Eric's, you probably remember this because I think you've mentioned this a couple times. What's significant about Jesus saying that the temple could be thrown into the sea? Yes. According to ancient Jewish belief, large bodies of water happen to be where demons and other hellish creatures like Leviathan, you've heard that name before, Leviathan? Leviathan was this big demonic snake that circled the cosmos, causing all kinds of diseases and natural disasters. That's where these creatures lived. Essentially, Jesus was saying that both religion and empire could go to hell where they belong, and we the people possess the power to banish them both. Jesus was a BAMF, you know. That was a lot of info we had to cover really quick. So, thank you. So, really quickly, we're going over by about 5 minutes today, but I think we're doing good. So we'll get to the application that spoke to me. So, for me, these stories summarize the true gospel of Jesus, right? An accurate depiction of the good news of Christ may not be what you have heard, but it's undeniable that the gospel is badass in context. Regrettably, the good news of Jesus is currently so misunderstood in America that the church has forgotten its purpose in waging ideological warfare against oppressive principalities, amoral profiteering, and corrupt authorities, to the point that we have endorsed governing officials with those exact values from our nation's pulpit. Donald Trump was signing damn Bibles as if Trump were the author this past week, y'all. I mean, in Trump's defense, like, he wrote just as much of that as, like, Art of the Deal. Like, I think he wrote about just as much of the Bible as Art of the Deal. But if adherents of Christianity celebrate our tyrannical emperor signing our sacred texts that contain accounts of a rabbinic rebel that was crucified by corrupt empire, then Christendom has failed the American people. Now, in this knowledge, it is time for Christians to declare that the time for nefarious administration in this country is up. It is time for followers of Christ to reclaim our mandate as prophets of equality. We must once again become a people unafraid to speak inconvenient truth to the cruel, the debauched, and the ignorant that presently sit elevated in our halls of business, governance, and worship. That night of the Passover feast, Jesus met with the disciples. Jesus broke unleavened bread and poured out some wine to share. Wine and bread were the two most affordable elements of the Passover ritual. The new sacraments that Jesus selected would be used in lieu of the sacrificial lamb. Now, why would Christ not eat a Passover lamb during the sacred feast? Was the first communion meant to abolish Judaic sacrificial practices? Was Jesus saying that the disciples would no longer need to slaughter a lamb to atone for their sins? That is exactly what Jesus was saying, but not for the reasons you have heard. Christ altered the elements for their Passover ritual as a visual tool to convince the disciples to boycott purchasing all sacrificial animals from the temple in the future. Because Rome had been profiting from imperial exchange rates at the money changers' tables. So communion was not some mystical memorial meal that could cleanse the disciples' souls. Communion was a symbolic protest of the injustices that developed after the merger of church and state. That invitation to continue this legacy of justice seeking is before everyone here today, regardless of your faith identity. On the night Jesus was betrayed, Jesus took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body, broken for you. Take and eat, and as often as you do so in remembrance of me." And likewise, Jesus took a cup and poured out some wine and passed it around and said, "This is my blood, poured out for you. Take and drink, and as often as you do so in remembrance of me." I know what you've heard about communion before. I want you to listen to what communion actually was. A statement against the marriage of empire and faith. And that marriage has been going on far too long, especially in Western culture. And it is time that the church stands up and says no more and stands between those that would oppress and say, "Not today." So if you would like, take those elements with us. Know that you are welcome here regardless of your faith. And I invite you to take what you learned today and make a difference out in a world that is desperately in need to see heaven here and now. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you.